African leaders at the UN General Assembly have also been speaking about the issue of peace and security, as well as permanent representation at the UN Security Council. Let's bring in Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs Commentator, for further discussion on this. So, Joseph, African leaders at the UN Assembly are warning of pressure to choose sides over the war in Ukraine. How can the continent maintain its neutrality amid this pressure?
I don't know how else except for them to be united and to be unanimous and to say that they are not anybody's poodle, that their position is a considered position, so that whichever side they take must be respected by the international community. You know, I think it's rather rich on this question that the war in Ukraine, African leaders are compelled to take sides when in the war in Iraq they were not consulted. Wars have taken place in Africa where quite clearly mainly Western European powers have got interests. And African leaders are pushed. Since our independence, there has been massive campaigns for African leaders, for Africa basically, to play a neutrality position, you know, with non-aligned movement. I know some of those things faded much more recently. But I think the Ukrainian war is now one for which I think there is an apparent bully. I think whatever happened in Ukraine, and it's not about taking positions, if it is the case that Russia went and took a position somewhere in the borders of the United States, there was bound to be a response, just if you can remember with the Cuban crisis. So it's quite clearly the case that you know, Africa should really not be dragged on this superpower NATO versus the other. And I think it's something which to me is colonial. And after 16 years of our independence, particularly today with the passing of the Queen and the emergence of a new generation, and in fact a new season on the African continent, African leaders are taking a position which is rather right. I hope they're united on this anyway this time.
Right. So let's look at the composition of the UN Security Council. Africa has been pushing for permanent representation for the continent at the Council. And this has been going on for years, yet there hasn't been much reforms at the Council for decades. Why?
It's because of the unwillingness, particularly of the founding members of the United Nations, and with the line that is actually being taken at the moment by the Big Five, particularly the core of Western European leaders, nations, with a link to your first question. It's really not in their interest for Africa to have a permanent position. I think it's something which is long overdue. I think African leaders should, from now on, begin to make this a permanent subject on an agenda item in every time there is a meeting, including bilateral meetings, not only to wait for meetings at the UN General Assembly. This should be a matter that actually possibly should be taken to African parliaments, so that there should be a public demand for African countries, for Africa as a continent, to deserve to have a permanent position on the at the United Nations. It's really long overdue.
And how important is that representation for the continent?
Sorry?
How important is it for Africa to have this representation?
I think it's important. If Africa had a position, if Africa had a position, they would not be bullied like you're asking me, Machale. If Africa had a position, they would take a position perhaps much more unanimously, or perhaps together as a continent. And I think if Africa had a position, they would be much more respected. Perhaps they would be much more consulted before people go to war, either in Ukraine or in Iraq. And if Africa had a position, the world would also know that Africa is part of the international community, part of the global community of nations, of peoples. So quite clear, it's very, very important symbolically. But beyond that, you know, normally when big issues happen, the US will sanction. Big issues happen when it's convenient, perhaps Russia will sanction. Maybe there's time for a situation in which Africa also has a position. And so maybe if there's something that happens which is not in our interest, perhaps if it was appetite, South African question, maybe African nation would come and also sanction something which is against the US interest. I think this is something which is substantially important, long overdue, and unless something like that happens, then the General Assembly is really a talking shop for leaders, when by and large, you know, international relations continues to remain a matter of interest for, a chosen few.
Now, President Macky Sall, during his address on Tuesday, said terrorism, which is gaining ground on the continent, is not just an African matter, but a global threat that falls under the primary responsibility of the UN Security Council. How then can the Council better engage with the continent in the fight against terrorism in Africa?
I think President Sall is absolutely right. Terrorism is not a new phenomenon, but where it is at the moment, it traces back to some of the global polity and the superpower polity. Terrorism in the earliest beats, if you like, into contemporary terms, it was something linked particularly to grievances in the Middle East conflicts, particularly Arab-Israeli conflicts, where, by the way, the Palestinian question was very divisive, and where in most cases African countries sided with the Palestinian question, and it was always an issue that perhaps sometimes led to overthrow of governments. And the same issue you can bring down to the question of Somalia. In the early 90s, when the US came, strategically really about who controls the waters of the Mediterranean, who controls the waters down the Kenyan Ocean, and who controls the shipping lines in down there. When the Somali pirates actually gave the Americans a beating, the Americans this time around said, look, perhaps we can have some foot soldiers called Ugandans and other Africans down there. But the reality is about grievances in the sub-region that nurtures these things. So most of the Islamic terrorists in Africa are a result of grievances from outside our continent, which is rather sad. So whatever is happening at the moment, I just hope that when we talk about terrorism in Africa, it's not about African governments also trying to silence a genuine democratic opposition or alternative opposition. But by and large, at a global level, really terrorism is an important issue in the African continent, so the international community should be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And they should actually support African governments in dealing with these issues.
All right, Joseph Ochieno, live for us in Kampala. Thank you for your time.